So next, we're going to be talking about the AWS IAM service. So at a high level, this is the service that controls access to AWS resources. So if you want to give someone within your company access to AWS, let's say through the console, for example, and you want them to be able to spin up EC2 servers, but nothing else, this would be the service where you would go and both create their user and also go in and configure what that user can do. Now, this service is free. So unlike many of the other services on AWS, where you pay based on the resources you create within the service, this service is included at no charge to everyone that has an AWS account. And it manages both authentication and authorization. And we kind of mentioned both of these earlier, but we didn't use the terms. Authentication is what verifies users for us and lets them log in and manages their credentials, for example. Authorization is where we actually configure what that user can do. So we could say you have access to all EC2 actions, but nothing else, for example. Now, IAM also supports a concept called identity federation. And this allows us to use an external identity provider to actually handle that authentication portion of IAM. Now, this might not make sense if you have a company of 3 people. You can simply go into IAM and you can create all of those users and manage their permissions. But if you have a company of 2,000 resources, all of whom need to have access to AWS, using an external identity provider, especially if you already have one in use, would totally make sense. Now, you don't need to know how identity federation works for the exam, but you do need to know that this is an option when you're working within IAM. Now, next, let's talk about the 3 different identity types that exist within IAM. And the first one is just a user. And this is an account for a single individual so that they can access AWS resources. So let's say we have a new employee named Jane, and she is one of our developers. And so we could go in, give Jane an account, and then give her permissions to access specific AWS resources. However, let's say it's not just Jane. Let's say Jane is a part of a new development team that we're bringing on board, and there are 5 developers. Well, we could easily go in and create an account for each of those, and then go in for each of them and then add the exact same permissions on all 5 of them. However, there is a better approach. So another identity type within AWS IAM is a group. And a group allows you to manage permissions for a group of IAM users. So you would still need to go in and create users for each of them. However, you could then go in and add them to a group and then assign permissions to that group. And when we're talking here about an IAM identity, we're really just saying anything that you can assign permissions to. And so we've talked about users, we've talked about groups. Now we have a third type that's a little bit different, and that is a type called a role. And this enables us to either have a user or a service assume permissions to perform a specific task. Now we have run across this already, although we didn't call it out. So when you launch an EC2 server, it has the option to specify a role for that server. So you could say that that server needs to have access to an S3 bucket, for example. Maybe a part of the web application on that server is that it needs to upload photos to an S3 bucket. Well, it can't do that by default. The permissions won't allow for that. However, you could give it a role and then give that role the permission of being able to write to that S3 bucket. And this is what you can do utilizing roles within IAM. Next, let's talk about how you assign permissions. And this is what leads us to the concept of policies within IAM. So a policy is just a JSON document, and it defines permissions for an IAM identity. So again, a user, group, or a role. And it defines both the services that the identity can access and what actions can be taken on that service. So let's go back to the example that we mentioned earlier with our EC2 server. We might want it to have read access and write access to a specific S3 bucket. But we wouldn't want it to have permissions for everything on S3, because that would also include deleting the bucket, and that's not a part of what that web application would need to do. So we can say that it can access the S3 service for just the read and write actions on a specific bucket. Also, policies can be either customer managed or managed by AWS. So let's look at the customer managed portion. So if you need custom policy needs, for example, in looking at our web application, if we know that we want to give that web application access to read and write to a specific bucket, we could write a custom policy to do that for us. But AWS also provides what are called managed policies. And these policies have already been created. So if you want to have something like read-only access to an entire AWS account, or if you want to have something like full access to S3, there are policies that AWS has already created and they maintain, and you can choose to use those without creating your own custom policies. Now, here is an example policy. Now, this is what's on the left side. Now, this is written as a JSON object, and you can go in and have specific permissions. Now, you can see here that we do have a statement here that is allowing. And in this case, it is allowing all S3 actions on a bucket and on the contents of that bucket. Right below that, we have another statement, and this is a statement denying access except for having access to that specific bucket and its contents. This is just an example policy. Now, as a note, you will not need to know how to create a policy or any of the specific aspects of policies for the exam, but I did want to give you an example in terms of what one of these policies looks like. Now, let's next talk about some different best practices when working within IAM. Now, the first best practice is multi-factor authentication. And what this does is this gives an extra layer of security for our users. So when they log in, they will log in with their username and their password, and then a token. And this is either going to be a physical or a virtual device that's going to generate that token for login. And you might have seen this in other places. Many web services now offer multi-factor authentication, but this is just another layer of security. Then we also have least privilege access, which we have already talked about. So when we're creating and managing users within IAM, it is ideal that we encourage our users to set up multi-factor authentication, and we configure permissions to be geared towards least privilege access.